Chapter 10. Into the Wilderness. As the sun rose on the fort that day, the air grew thick and hot. The sky looked as if it wanted to rain but was holding back. The settlers went about their chores out of habit, but their minds were on the tragic events of the morning. They gathered in clumps and discussed the attack. Some people pointed a finger at Isaac, saying that the white Indian boy was trouble and had somehow had a hand in the raid. Others said the raid was a warning sign from God. Still other settlers saw the attack as the start of another war. "We're in for trouble with those French and Indians," one soldier advised. "No one will be safe." Celinda came home from the Cutters as if she were in a fog. "All day long people came and talked about the raid," she told Rebecca. "'Twas almost more than I could bear. I kept remembering—" She broke off. Rebecca held her sister's hand. "I know," she said. That night, as soon as Celinda fell asleep, Rebecca climbed out of bed and put her dress back on. She sat upright on the hard wooden floor, willing herself to stay awake in case Isaac left the house. "I can't fail. I simply can't. I must find the spoons, and I must find out what Isaac is doing at night." It was a long night. Twice Celinda awoke screaming, gasping in terror from the horrors of her nightmares. Again and again Rebecca comforted her. "I'm here. All is well." "And Mama and Papa will come back? And Benjamin?" "Of course they will," Rebecca said. "Mama promised they would." "And no one will separate us?" Celinda asked. "I won't let them," Rebecca assured her. But how, she wondered, how? After each of the nightmares it took Rebecca almost an hour to get her sister back to sleep. She was sure, however, that Isaac was at home during that time. She listened carefully to his breathing downstairs, and heard him moving in his sleep. In the middle of the night there was a heavy knocking at the door. Rebecca hurried down the ladder and looked out. It was Ezekiel, carrying a lantern and his musket. "I'm on guard duty tonight," he announced as Rebecca unlatched the door. "I'm checking to be sure that white Indian boy is here." He elbowed his way past Rebecca and shone his light into Isaac's corner. Isaac was lying on the bed asleep, or pretending to be. "Huh," Ezekiel grunted, and stalked out the door. Rebecca returned to the loft and struggled to stay awake until the sun sent a hazy light across the eastern horizon. Then, finally, she allowed herself to drift off to sleep. Her last thought was, "I'm sure Isaac did not leave the house in the night. Was he just being cautious? Or have I been wrong about him after all?" Sunday morning dawned cool and rainy, with a cloud of fog hanging over the river valley. The dismal weather matched Rebecca's spirits. She felt tired from her sleepless night and filled with anxiety. It was the Sabbath, though, so she splashed cold water on her face and neatly combed her hair to prepare for Sunday worship. Celinda scrubbed her face and tied back her brown curls. They both put on their shoes and their best Sunday aprons. Then they were ready for church. The widow talked to Isaac and Abenaki, and somehow, Rebecca couldn't guess how, convinced them to go to the church with them. They all walked together down the length of the fort's yard. The widow leaned on Isaac's arm. Rebecca and Celinda followed behind. "Today I will pray to God for a miracle," Celinda told her sister as they walked together arm in arm. "A miracle that will let me stay here with you." "We'll need a miracle," Rebecca thought. "Either that or the silver spoons." She saw Ezekiel Cutter walking toward them. He was now dressed in his Sunday clothes, but there was still a sneer on his face. He stared at Isaac, then announced, "So now they are letting heathen savages into church?" The widow raised her hand to one ear. "Eh?" she asked. "What's that?" Isaac acted as if he had not heard anything. Ezekiel followed them as they filed into the building and walked upstairs to the great chamber where the Sunday services were held. It was a large open room filled with rows of narrow wooden benches. The chamber's windows overlooked the field surrounding the fort. There were small, narrow windows which were just large enough to aim a musket through. There were also bigger windows with heavy shutters that could be fastened from within in case of attack. Widow Tyler found a bench near the back. Ezekiel took a seat right behind them. Whenever Rebecca glanced back, she saw Ezekiel staring at Isaac like a cat that had cornered a field mouse. Rebecca felt her tension growing as she waited for the church service to begin. Finally, the elder who was leading the church service walked into the great chamber carrying his Bible. All the settlers stood up. Isaac, with a little prodding from the widow, rose to his feet too. Then he crossed himself. Rebecca heard an outcry from behind her. "Look!" Ezekiel cried out. "He made the sign that the French do." Everyone turned and saw Ezekiel pointing at Isaac. Ezekiel imitated how Isaac had gestured with his right hand, making the sign of the cross against his body. There was an angry murmur among the churchgoers, and one of the pew-minders stepped forward. It was Mr. Thompson, a husky man who was responsible for maintaining order in the church. He pulled Isaac off his bench. "We'll have none of that here," he said roughly. "The boy meant no harm. He was only doing what he's been taught," the widow protested. "He must have learned it from a French missionary." "We'll learn him different," Mr. Thompson declared. He pushed Isaac out the door, and Rebecca heard a heavy clumping on the stairs. She saw Ezekiel grin. Other settlers looked relieved that the white Indian boy was now gone. But Rebecca felt troubled. As much as she distrusted Isaac, she did not believe that he had meant to do wrong by crossing himself. "Isaac doesn't know our ways yet," Celinda whispered. "Why do they punish him?" "I don't know," Rebecca replied, but she'd seen the eyes of the people seated around her. She realized that they hated Isaac because he was still too much like an Indian. For the first time she wondered what would happen after Isaac's kin came from New York to fetch him. Would he ever be truly accepted? The morning church service lasted 4 hours. For Rebecca it seemed to drag on forever. Several times she nodded off to sleep, only to be awakened by a nudge from Celinda's elbow, or a hard tap from Mr. Thompson's long stick. Finally the service was over. Rebecca and Celinda were walking home with Widow Tyler when Mrs. Cutter overtook them. "Celinda," she called out in her shrill voice, "remember, the soldiers are riding out at first light tomorrow morning. Our family and the Polk shall ride with them. See that you are packed and ready." The widow frowned. "Amelia Cutter, this is the Sabbath. You can't expect the child to work at packing her things on the Sabbath." Mrs. Cutter pointedly ignored the widow. "See that you are ready," she repeated to Celinda. "Anything you don't have prepared will be left behind. Good day." Then she marched off. "Some people think only of themselves," the widow said angrily at Mrs. Cutter's back. Then she turned and put her arm around Celinda's narrow shoulders. "I am so sorry you must leave, my dear," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I shall pray for you every day." "Thank you, ma'am," Celinda said, her head hung low. Rebecca did not trust herself to speak. Celinda's time was running out quickly, and she did not know how to save her. She was so angry that she found a stone and kicked it across the yard. She followed it with her eye and watched it land next to old Johnny, who was walking in the opposite direction. He looked rumpled this morning, but he seemed sober. A desperate plan occurred to Rebecca. "Excuse me, ma'am," she told the widow. She quickly crossed the yard. "Good day, sir," she called to old Johnny. "May I speak with you?" He glanced up and a look of recognition crossed his face. "I don't do business on the Sabbath," he said, and tried to walk past her. Rebecca flushed with embarrassment, but she continued. "I know, but I have some things I must sell by dawn tomorrow." "I told you, child, I don't want to talk business." "Please, sir," Rebecca pleaded, "'tis very important. I could meet you here in the yard tomorrow, before first light." The peddler looked around the yard. A few settlers were watching them curiously. "Very well," he agreed at last. "I'll meet you here at first light tomorrow." "Thank you," said Rebecca. Rebecca returned to the widow's house with a glimmer of hope in her heart. Now if she could find the spoons, she would be able to sell them before the Cutters left. If she couldn't find the spoons, then she would offer the peddler everything she and Celinda owned, except the clothes on their backs. She would sell their last blanket, their winter clothes, and even their shawls. She wasn't at all sure what their few remaining belongings would earn, but it was the last hope she had, and she clung to it. At home, Rebecca found the widow dozing in her chair, the Bible open in her lap. Isaac sat whittling with the long knife. Rebecca wondered what had happened to him after he had been thrown out of church. But as usual, Isaac was silent. The widow did not allow the girls to work on the Sabbath, so they had a cold dinner. The rain was falling heavily now, and it was gloomy inside the cabin. Widow Tyler read aloud from the Bible and said prayers until the bell tolled for the late afternoon church service. Rebecca and Celinda prepared to leave, but the widow said she was tired. "I'll stay here. Isaac can remain here as well." Rebecca and Celinda stepped out into the muddy yard. The rain had settled into a heavy gray mist. "'Tis so foggy out here," said Celinda. "'Tis almost like evening." "Aye," said Rebecca thoughtfully. "'Tis almost like evening." A sudden suspicion occurred to her. "Celinda, I'm going back to the house. If anyone asks where I am, tell them I'm home taking care of the widow." Celinda's brow furrowed. "That would be the truth, wouldn't it?" "Yes," Rebecca lied, "it would be true." She paused. "And Celinda, keep praying for a miracle." Celinda smiled. "I shall." Rebecca watched her sister limp into the fog. Then she turned back as if she were headed home. But instead of returning to the widow's house, Rebecca stopped next door at the Grays' lean-to. The lean-to is a simple shack. It has walls on 3 sides, but the 4th side, which faced the yard, was open. The Grays had a cabin outside the fort, but they stayed in their lean-to whenever there was threat of an Indian attack. This afternoon the family had gone to church, and the lean-to was deserted. Rebecca stood in the shadows and waited. "God forgive me for lying to my sister," she thought, but I must know whether Isaac leaves the fort." Hidden in the shadows of the lean-to, Rebecca kept an eye on the widow's house. She watched and waited, looking first out the front of the lean-to, then checking the back window. She saw no one except the guards. She was beginning to wonder if she had made a mistake, when she caught a movement behind the widow's cabin. A thin figure slipped out of the back window, and with movements as stealthy as a bobcat, disappeared into the mist. "He shan't get away this time," Rebecca vowed to herself. She hitched up her petticoats and climbed out the Grays' back window. She looked around for the thin figure. She couldn't see him anywhere. The stretch of land between the houses and the palisade seemed empty. The only sounds were the patter of rain and the occasional voices that filtered out from the worship service. Rebecca crept across the open space and hid behind the woodpile. Suddenly she heard someone approaching. It was the guard making his rounds. For a moment Rebecca considered calling the guard and telling him that Isaac had run away from the widow's house. But she still did not know where the spoons were hidden, and she was sure that if Isaac were arrested, he would never admit to stealing anything. "I must follow him myself," Rebecca decided. "Once I find where he's hidden the spoons, then I'll alert the guards." As the guard came closer, Rebecca felt her heart pounding. She flattened herself against the woodpile, her nose pressed into the earthy smell of the wet logs. The guard passed by, whistling softly to himself. Then everything was quiet again. Rebecca peered into the mist. "Where can Isaac be?" she wondered. "Have I lost him already?" Then she saw a shadowy movement by the palisade. A figure swiftly emerged from the darkness and lifted himself hand over hand up the 14-foot-high log. He climbed so quickly and easily that Rebecca could scarcely believe it. She remembered how Private Chandler had declared that Isaac could climb faster than a squirrel. "So that's how he's been escaping the fort," thought Rebecca. Within moments, Isaac was over the palisade and down on the grounds below. Briefly he stood motionless against the palisade, and then he headed down a path that led to the river. Rebecca felt her stomach knot with fear as she watched Isaac disappear into the fog. There was danger beyond the palisade. Wild animals, and worse, savage Indians. Yet if she were ever to discover what Isaac had been doing, she had to follow him. Now. She ran to the northwest corner of the palisade and found the gap where she had once been able to enter the fort. She took a deep breath and tried to wiggle through the opening. At first she thought she could no longer pass between the logs. She had grown too much. Then she exhaled, forcing all the air out of her chest. She pushed as hard as she could. Suddenly she was out of the fort. She hurried down the path Isaac had taken. The path headed northwest, past her family's farm and toward the river. When her family had lived together on the farm, they had taken this route frequently, but never before had Rebecca walked it alone or in a fog. The old path, which once seemed so familiar, now looked strange. Trees loomed in the darkness, and at every turn Rebecca wondered whether there was an Indian waiting, poised to attack her. She imagined the tomahawk aimed straight for her head. Would anyone hear me scream? As she headed farther and farther from the safety of the fort, Rebecca wished desperately that she could turn back. But she thought of Celinda and what would happen if they couldn't find the spoons. She kept on going. She walked as quietly as she could and listened to all the sounds around her. There was rustling among the leaves and steady rain, but she could not hear any footsteps. The path came to a fork. One side led uphill to the north past the old farm. The other side led downhill, west to the river. Rebecca hesitated and then heard a noise uphill, as if someone had stepped on a stick. She froze. Although the evening was cool and her dress was drenched with rain, she broke into a sweat. Was it Isaac? After a few moments of silence, she carefully turned and made her way up the hill. At the top, the forest cleared. There was an open field, and Rebecca could see the ruins of her family's home outlined against the sky. She could see a figure outlined against the sky, too. It was Isaac. She crouched by the edge of the woods, not far from fairyland. She watched Isaac walk through the burned remains of her family's cabin. He opened the door to the old root cellar and climbed inside. After a few moments, he came up out of the cellar. Then he disappeared into the woods. Rebecca waited and watched until finally curiosity overpowered her fear. She hurried across the open field and through the ruins of the cabin. She hesitated for a moment when she saw the cellar door. Unlike the building around it, it had not been damaged by the fire. The thick wooden door in the ground looked much as it had when the building was whole. The trapdoor brought back a flood of painful memories. In her mind, she could see Mama leaning over the open trapdoor. "Watch over your sister," Mama had said. "I'm counting on you." I must do this, Rebecca told herself. I must. She gritted her teeth and pulled up the heavy cellar door. Then the smell wafted up to her, the same odor of old potatoes and damp earth that she remembered. She forced herself to climb down the wooden ladder. It creaked under her weight. At the base of the ladder, her foot pressed against something. She put her hand down and felt what seemed to be a blanket with items bundled up inside it. Quickly she grabbed the bundle and hurried out of the cellar, leaving the door open behind her. As soon as she was outside, she looked down at the bundle in her arms. It was tied together with Priscilla's red silk hair ribbon. He is the thief, Rebecca thought. She tore off the ribbon and opened the blanket. Wrapped inside, she found a man's heavy jacket, 3 loaves of bread, a brick of cheese, and a flint box. But where were the spoons? Had she missed them somehow in the darkness? She looked through the sleeves of the jacket and felt inside the pocket. There was nothing. Could the spoons have dropped from the blanket when she opened it? She had just begun to search the ground when she felt sharp steel against her throat. "What are you doing here?" a low voice demanded from behind her.